data governance is definitely changing, and it's undergoing a radical change with the explosion of the variety of data and with increasing demands on those data sets. New methodologies needed to be found. I think there's still a reliance on the older methodologies. So you take from that what is useful, but I think the operative word these days is pragmatism and relevance. Data governance needs to be relevant to a whole variety of stakeholders throughout the organization. Otherwise, a data governance framework just ends up being a document that goes into somebody's top drawer.
I think there is a lot of value which has been demonstrated not just by the work that we've done, but by a number of organizations that we've worked with to move away from that model, not creating those bloated artifacts which, as you said, go into someone's drawer. Now more than ever, the data volumes are only getting bigger. You've got a variety of data that is being produced by the organization, and the velocity at which that data is produced is essentially increased tenfolds, if not more.
Yeah, and just don't forget that as data work is becoming very pervasive throughout the organization, and so data governance and the methodologies and the frameworks you create has to keep up with that. I think what we saw 10, even 5 years ago isn't going to satisfy that reality. And so you need to be able to explain to the data workers on the ground, those guys working in the trenches who have the problems, the pain points, the opportunities, as well as the requirements, the data related requirements. You have to explain to them why data governance is relevant to them and why it will help satisfy their needs. But by the same token, don't forget the exec is a very important player here as well. They are driven by corporate drivers. So whilst you focus and pivot data governance around those user stories at the lower level in the organization, you have to also create the lineage right through to corporate drivers so that the exec understands the impact of something down here to a corporate driver up there, and vice versa.
So Etienne, what we're essentially talking about is creating some sort of a tracking mechanism to link those strategic initiatives, drivers that are taking the organization forward to the problems on the ground.
Correct.
Faced by the operational folk.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in our data governance engagements, we focus on two things. The first being looking at the various data worker personas that exist within the organization. And these, from experience, what we've observed that these are common across organizations and industries. The second thing that we look at, as we've touched on before, is the user stories, and those are the requirements, pain points, or gaps in terms of data solutions or data processes that need to be looked at, and then creating that link, that lineage between those two things to see what sort of problems exist within the organization.
I think it's also important to understand that data governance frameworks increasingly starts to incorporate other areas not typically associated with data governance. As I said previously, you've got more data workers typically now across organizations, and it's really important that they operate within very clear guidelines, not very strict guidelines, but very clear guidelines. And so operational frameworks that in the past was not typically associated with data governance are now incorporated into it and becomes part of it. Whether it is the way you ingest data into a data lake, for example, the way you segment your data lake, the way in which data engineers are able to create authoritative data assets and data scientists are able to create authoritative models, the way in which people throughout the business, subject matter experts, model their specific area, finance, HR, etc. And what happens? How do you deploy that? Data need not be perfect to be useful, but it's really important that people understand when they look at data, what they are looking at. And so those operational frameworks are increasingly important, and that is a big part of the focus. And so it's not just the personas and those user stories that you've mentioned that is important. That is absolutely, that's the pivot, but it's the processes as well as the technology that enables and almost triggers a lot of these aspects that I've mentioned.
I think it's important to stress that data governance is not something that is solitary and this thing off to the sides as a lot of organizations and delivery partners view it. It is embedded into everything that we do as a data partner. So that's something that needs to be, could not be stressed enough. So whether it's through frameworks, operational and strategic,
even
architectures, or user stories, requirements, pain points that we gather, it is an integral part of all of those things.
Purview is new in the market. It's gone GA only a month or so ago, but we've been involved in Purview since just after its inception, and we kept a very keen eye on its roadmap. It was a huge blind spot, I think, in the Azure ecosystem, but what I like about Purview is the ease at which you can automatically classify data, use AI kind of methodology and mechanisms to classify data. Think of credit card information. If you've got a lake full of data that just moves in at a huge velocity, you're not necessarily going to know where all your credit card information is. But because of the pattern recognition capabilities built into Purview, it will find those elements you are looking for, and it will highlight and shine the spotlight on certain things you might not even know existed. Secondly, there's a crowdsourcing methodology whereby data owners and data custodians throughout the business, those people who understand the data wherever they are, can contribute to the intelligence of the data. So yes, I can see my credit card information here, but that is not how we as an organization refer to that element. Mm-hmm. So let's create an entry in the business glossary. You change it once and it will find and it will adhere to that pattern that you've set. That's the second thing. The important thing is the ability to tie all of your data in with sensitivity labels. Security is no less important now than it's ever been. It is really important, but you need, as with data governance, a new focus on security, because all of a sudden more workers have access to data. And so what is the sensitivity over your data elements? Purview ties in with the Microsoft 365 sensitivity regime. And so as an organization as a whole, you are starting to leverage work from a sensitivity perspective you do elsewhere as well. The same with the business glossary. And the last one is the ability to classify the state of your data. Workers want to bring data to the ecosystem. Let's call that BYO data. That needs to be classified as Etienne's only exploratory data, for example. Does that make Etienne's exploratory data less important to somebody else? It might actually be very relevant, as long as that person understands that it's of a bronze status, for example. So that's just Purview in its current release. There are many more modules on the radar, which I think is just going to make it a better technology. The main thing about Purview is the fact that it actually triggers a lot of data governance concepts, whereas in the past, a data governance framework would have had to focus and call out the need for data custodians, data ownership, decision-making bodies, decision-making rights. By implementing Purview, you are almost forced to start thinking about those things. So it's a very good trigger and a pragmatic way by which data governance does evolve in the organization.